So we're here on a nice sunny June day in 2022 with Dick Glew, infectious disease specialist, now retired, and we're going to talk about your career. You want to start at the beginning? What made you choose medicine?
I've been asked that many times and I'm not sure. I think as I got into college and started taking courses, I realized I had an affinity for, an enjoyment of, and talent for the biological sciences. The biological sciences, if you look down the road at what careers there are, the best one is medicine. I do not come from a medical family. None of my 5 siblings are in medicine. None of my 4 children entered medicine. It just seemed to be the thing to do. And to put things in perspective, I got out of high school in 1957, 61. But during high school, 57 to 61 was Sputnik.
Yeah.
And the U.S. government decided to pour tons of money with very favorable scholarships into the sciences, what people nowadays call STEM. And the scientific undergraduate educational facilities became hot stuff. So in fact, I applied to 2 engineering schools and 2 liberal arts schools. I quickly realized as decisions were coming, I was not cut out to be an engineer. My math skills, my 3-dimensional skills were not going to do well. But I like people. I enjoy trying to figure things out, like many kids my age. I was enthralled with the Hardy Boy detective books, so the thought of working through problems and figuring things out seemed to be a great idea. So as I moved through college, I began probably by halfway through decided that medical school was where I was going to go. And Harvard had a very permissive biology major, where only about half of the courses you took were in either biology, other sciences, or math. So half of my coursework was liberal arts. There was no pre-med anything, no pre-med major, no pre-med concentration. And when I got to Hopkins, which is where I went to med school, there were 5 other guys from Harvard in my entering freshman class, none of whom I knew. So we had all been in a pre-med pattern at Harvard, but with different majors, and most of the science courses you had to take were big enough you didn't necessarily get to know the person unless he or she was a lab mate. So it was funny. Harvard was very, I wouldn't say loosey-goosey, but certainly was very liberal arts oriented, as opposed to, say, Holy Cross, where the day you enter, you were told you're on a track and that 3/4 of you aren't going to make it. I had a couple of Holy Cross classmates at Hopkins who said, first day in class, the old thing, look to your left, look to your right. 2 of you aren't going to be pre-meds by the time 4 years roll around. They didn't force them out of pre-med, because I've talked to students since, but they would decline to give them solid recommendations and impetus into med school, unless they did another year or 2 of something scientific to elevate their appeal.
How'd you like Hopkins?
I liked the med school because primarily because it was small. We had only 96 students in the class, so you got to know everybody pretty well. It did have a high nerd component, which the undergraduate campus has as well, very competitive. And Hopkins at that time had a strange transition system called the 2-5 program, where people either at Hopkins undergraduate or in another college or university could apply to medical school in their 2nd year. And if they got accepted, they had a 5-year med school program, with the first year being a crash course in the pre-medical sciences. So these guys were young. They weren't children or playground types, but they certainly had, some of them had a maturity problem. Plus they were nerds. They were They were young nerds, and it took them a while to kind of relax and get into. I remember we had a guy from Morgantown, West Virginia, who was delivered by the obstetrician that delivered the New York Giants football player Sam Huff.
Okay.
And that was one of the topics that would come up whenever I talked to him. But the other was, he would always say, I took all graduate courses at this thick West Virginia. I took all graduate courses. They were hard, but I got all A's. He literally wore his Phi Beta Kappa key to class. He did relax later on, but a lot, probably 20% of the students were uber nerds. Maybe that's in all med schools, I don't know. But there were a lot of driven people. On the other hand, when you've only got 96 students, you're in each other's circle, often collaborating in the lab or on a project, and people, I think, got more collegial and less frenetic as the years went by. But it was fun. Baltimore's not much of a city, but probably the best thing in picking Hopkins is I'd gone, 400 miles south, and when I arrived there, there was a posting on a bulletin board in the lobby of the med school that said it was looking for hockey players. And I played hockey through high school, and in college I played JV. So I called up the number and I said, I'm interested in your program. Do you have tryouts? And the guy said, where are you from? And I said, Massachusetts. He said, you don't need to try out, because there was no hockey in Baltimore at the time. So I played there, played hockey during the first couple of years of med school, and had fun, got to meet some people.
Yeah. So now this is sort of where the template for 2 years of basic science and 2 years of clinical was developed in modernizing the medical schools, some time ago. What do you think of your education? Looking back on it, what were the strengths and weaknesses of how you were taught in medical school?
I'm not sure there were any weaknesses. We had a certain amount of liberalizing content on which you were graded. We had a history of medicine course, which was taught by a guy named Oswald Temkin, who was one of the early pioneers in medical history, and in fact had arrived at Hopkins when the 4 founding fathers were still there, Osler and Halsted. And he made it interesting and exciting. I'm trying to think what else. Well, to me, psychiatry was a liberal arts experience, because Hopkins at that time was heavily Freudian. So it was a lot about self-analysis, contemplation. And I thought the 2 years of basic science weren't pure basic science, even in those archaic days. We still had experiences on the wards. We did group tours with a senior resident or a chief resident. Were brought into patients' rooms, heard clinical presentations. So there was some exposure. And I think there was enough to keep us comfortable, but also enough to familiarize us with what went on in the wards when it happened, once you got there in the 3rd year.
And as you progressed through medical school, how did you choose a specialty? What was your thinking then?
Well, I could take out all of the interventional fields, like OBGYN, because I've got klutzy hands. My fine motor skills are not very good, and I didn't think it was a good idea to put those hands inside anybody. So I realized that anything with a surgical bent, or even a procedural bent, was not going to work. As I went through training, I got decent at some procedural activities, but they were fairly simple and straightforward, like intubation, starting central lines. But whatever I went into was not going to be procedural, which took out not only surgery, OBGYN, orthopedics, but it also took out about half of the internal medicine subspecialties. I also, as I said, as a kid, I loved detective work, the detective books, the TV shows like Dragnet, and ID has that figure it out quality. Not too many people walk in with a 3x5 card that says, my doc says I have this, will you please treat me? Right. Secondly, selfishly, ID was one of the fields among many that had strong therapeutic implications. I remember the The opposite for me was neurology, where there were no therapies.
Yeah.
The doc would come in with brilliant analysis and three-dimensional imaging, be able to tell the patient and the family what they had, and then basically say, there is no treatment, I'm out of here. Management, yes. Treatment, no.
Yeah.
So ID at that time, at least with bacterial infections, and even somewhat with fungal infections, and certainly with my favorite infection, which is malaria, there was good treatment. So ID was, I like gratification. I like to be able to make a neat diagnosis, but even better is to be able to treat it, to give people hope.
Yep.
So ID was perfect. No need to use my hands. Use your brain and your eyes. And I get very excited about microbiology, parasitology. In fact, when I arrived here, I was probably the only one in town with notable malaria experience, because I'd done 2 years of research at NIH with both human malaria and primate malaria. So I had read quantitatively and qualitatively probably tens of thousands of blood smears with malaria, determining species, parasite count. So I would come in anytime, day or night, to look at a blood smear, which the technicians loved. They were trained and good at it, but they loved having an interested physician come share in the visual experience.
Yeah, geez. So where did you do your residency?
At Hopkins.
Also. And did you do your fellowship there as well?
No, I did 2 years of NIH, which had minimal, well, it had some clinical experience.
Okay.
And in fact, I volunteered at Emory Hospital as a cardiologist. Not that I was very good, but I'd written a couple of papers, and they were looking for warm bodies to cover when people were out. So I did a couple of years of once-a-week cardiology at Emory. But I then did my clinical fellowship at the Mass General.
Great. And during your residency, can you describe life in those days?
Well, it's hard without getting into the wooden ships and Iron Men posturing. I mean, have you ever spoken to a resident of any age, older than you, 40 years younger than you, who doesn't believe fervently that they have the hardest residency that ever existed? And if you start to tell them what your call schedule was, their eyes glaze over and they hope their beeper goes off. But literally at Hopkins, it was the days of wooden ships and Iron Men. Hopkins and I think it was Duke had the two most notorious residency call schedules. Basically, you were on 6 out of 7 days, 24/6. We admitted 2 days out of 3, so you had a third day that was non-admitting, which allowed you to catch up on some of your work. But you were on duty.
They provide you with a place to sleep in the hospital?
No, not really. You would find one. I mean, I would find an empty room to sleep in it. I remember being woken up in the cardiac cath bed on our cardiac floor and being asked to leave because they had to do a cath. But there were literally no official beds. So you just kept going, or you slept with your head down on a desk. But the other advantage was, because of the call schedule, virtually everybody lived within walking distance of the hospital. And if you know East Baltimore or Hopkins, that was a mixed blessing. You would take your life in your hands if you lived in private housing, in a row house. But a couple of people did, and one of them, a few years after I got through, had a couple of robbers break in, pulled out his pistol, and shot one of them. But we lived in hospital-owned housing, literally a block away out the front door of the hospital. It went by the unappealing name of the compound, and it was actually 2 square arrays of housing with an internal grass courtyard and some playground equipment. So we had kids we had one child in med school, another one born during internship. And it was great because the kids could be let out in the backyard. It was closed, you couldn't get in there without going through one of the apartments. And everybody, looked after everybody else's kids. But being able to walk 1 block to the hospital meant that even on call, even admitting that day, the 2 out of 3 days you admitted. If things were quiet, you'd stop in the ED. If you had all your patients on the floor secured, you'd go to the ED, see where you were in the admission roster. And if it looked quiet, you'd go down the hill to your apartment, which was a 2-story, 2-bedroom apartment, living room and kitchen, and spend time up. You could even try to go to sleep, but if your beeper went off, you were back at the hospital. Sure. But, you know, like most of life, it was mixed. Yes, you had to live near the hospital, but that gave you the ability to go home when you weren't doing something in the hospital.
And you were married then?
Yes. I got married between first and second year of med school.
Mm-hmm.
And then Dottie had the first baby in our class. Mm-hmm. Someone later entered the class, I think third year, and brought a baby with him. But we had the first baby born in the class, mm-hmm. which gave me a great advantage in pediatrics. Mm-hmm. I knew how you feed babies, change babies, how to tell when they're sick or not. And I was comfortable picking them up, examining them. In fact, briefly, I considered going into pediatrics.
Now, you were in medical school and residency when a number of things were happening with regard, I mean, the rubella syndrome was kind of discussed or discovered or whatever then. And vaccines, there were a number of vaccines that were introduced during that period of time. So you were basically thinking about ID and moving into the field when it was really red hot.
Oh yeah, I would say at that time, except maybe for some of the technology that was coming into, say, orthopedics or mm-hmm. other high-tech surgical fields, ID was probably the hottest field. Cardiology, you know, had digitalis. Mm-hmm. I remember when propranolol came out, mm-hmm. the thiazide diuretics, spironolactone. But ID had some, you know, rapidly emerging antibiotics. I came in somewhere during med school and entering into internship is when the aminoglycosides went from streptomycin and kanamycin, which were dangerous, couldn't be followed from a therapeutic level point of view, and weren't very broadly acting. Mm-hmm. Their gram-negative range was pretty narrow. Suddenly, gentamicin came out, mm-hmm. And that was fantastic. The semi-synthetic penicillins came out. We moved from only one functional cephalosporin, cefalothin, mm-hmm. or cefazolin, its close cousin, to getting into the second and third generation cephalosporin. So yeah, I lived through it was already pretty good when I started, but antibiotics started coming out in rapid succession.
And vaccines, too.
And vaccines.
Yeah. And
when I started, the hepatidides were not identifiable.
Right.
Literally, hepatitis A was called short incubation hepatitis. Hepatitis B was called long incubation hepatitis. And hepatitis we now call C was other. It was the cases you couldn't identify. Uh-huh. So yeah, a lot of exciting to happen both diagnostically and therapeutically.
Yeah.
It was a fun field.
And then you graduated from med school and finished your residency, and then you went to NIH for 2 years.
Right.
And then you moved over to Mass General.
Right.
2 years?
2 years.
How was Mass General?
It was fun, exciting, very reminiscent of Hopkins. Mm-hmm. And the same thing. Hopkins was the first, at least we believe it was, the first modern American medical school built on the German model. Right. The founding four had all studied in Europe, mm-hmm. Germany and a little bit in France and in England, mm-hmm. so that they built a modern medical university. And in fact, they were the most heavily cited institution in the so-called Flexner Report, which trashed most of American medicine.
Well, wasn't he from there?
I think his brother was.
His brother was?
I think his brother was.
But,
he was a little prejudiced, but yeah. I mean, there were some pretty sorry medical schools. Right here in Massachusetts, the last to close was Middlesex, which is where Brandeis is now.
Yeah.
Did not need a college degree to go there. Veterinary medicine were interchangeable depending on what you wanted to do as you were graduating. It was awful.
Yeah.
So yeah, it was exciting. A lot of history at both places.
Yeah.
I think Hopkins didn't have the mega feel that the MGH has. Partly the entrance to it is the original building, which looks like a turn-of-the-century hotel. And I don't know if you've ever been inside it. When you walk in the front, there's about a 15-foot ugly statue of Christ, which had no function except to try to get community sympathy. Hopkins is not a religious institution, but the rumor is that by putting up Christ, they gave medicine kind of a clerical feel to it to add further to its credibility. But the place never felt overwhelming. The medical floors, for example, there were 7, there was no Osler 1. Osler 2 through 8, each of which was probably, I would guess, 40 beds, some of which were 4-bed wards, some of which were semi-private rooms. But it didn't have an overwhelmingly massive feel to it. The newest building was the Pediatric Center, and that kind of, although it was connected, it felt like it was by itself. The psych facility was by itself across the courtyard. So the place just felt a little more familial. The MGH, we used to call it the massive genital, and it really does feel massive. That white building, as you come up to the front, is about a 14-story building looming over the entrance. I'm not sure what the bed capacity was at that time, but it did feel big.
Over 1,000.
But otherwise, the I would say the friendly competition. Everybody thought they were top flight, world leaders, were going to be running hospitals and medical schools someday. But there wasn't a lot of snobbery or cutthroat. In fact, I remember during probably the first year of my fellowship, one of the residents who rotated through ID for a month was incredibly cutthroat. He would try to humiliate the med students by pimping them during conference. And he was treated with very much a cold shoulder by all of the ID people because he was picking on the kids. And that's not, it's an elite hospital with a lot of self-confidence, but it's not a cruel place.
Oh, that's good. And so what were the strengths of your fellowship at Mass General?
To start with, it was the chief of ID, Mort Swartz, who literally was the smartest person in the hospital and was widely recognized to be the wisest person in the hospital. When they had a 70th birthday party for him, several of us were invited back, and I was asked to give a talk representing, I was young enough at that time, what the fellows felt about Mort Swartz. But better yet was they asked a very close colleague of his, who I think was in training about when he was there. And he said that his impression of Mort Swartz is when you talk to people and would describe him as the smartest person in the hospital, people would say, no, he's not. He's the second smartest person in the hospital. That is, he's the second smartest gastroenterologist, the second smartest orthopedist. And then go on. He's the smartest overall, but he knew everything about everything. Very mild-mannered, soft-spoken, nice guy. In my talk, he was a big Celtics fan. In fact, he had season tickets and took me to one of their games. Never told him how much I despise basketball for many reasons. But what I gave him was a very short speech. And it was based on a basketball. I got a basketball, bought a basketball. A friend of mine knew Bob Cousy very well. So I had him get Bob Cousy to sign the basketball and dedicate it to Mort Swartz. Mort had always liked a player you probably never heard of named Hank Finkel. Hank Finkel was a 7'1", 7'2" guy whose lifetime NBA scoring was probably about 2.5 points a game. He'd been a big star in college at Dayton because of his size, but for the Celtics, he was a big body. So I found out where he worked. He had a small business renting office furniture. Called him up and said I wanted to get his autograph on a basketball for my boss. Would he do it? He said, sure. And when I got there, he said, nobody ever comes to see me because of basketball. He said, so you've made my week by coming. and I had him sign the ball. So when I gave the balls out, I said I gave him the Bob Cousy ball because Bob Cousy was the best basketball player in the world at the time. And I gave him Hank Finkel because Hank Finkel is the rest of us. We're
Nice.
the also-rans like Hank Finkel, doing our job, working hard, but never going to dazzle anybody as long as Mort Schwartz is in the room.
Interesting. Okay, great. So you finish your fellowship and you're thinking about going into practice.
Right.
How'd that go?
Easy. Job opportunities at that time. ID fellowship programs are not very big. I think at that time, the fellowship program at the General, as you said, 1,000-bed hospital. I think there, at any one time, there were maybe 6 of us. So ID jobs were easy to fill. Once ID jobs started to happen, again, taking you back to the 60s, ID was probably the last specialty to become part of any hospital, any healthcare system, and certainly academic healthcare systems. People thought, hey, there's only 5 or 6 antibiotics. How hard is this? The lab tells me what the patient's got. I look it up and give them the antibiotic. So often, medical centers, the last medical subspecialty they filled was ID. Once you get there and show them how much help you are diagnostically, therapeutically, and with allergy damage control, they like you. But there were more jobs than graduates, so getting offers was not difficult. I looked at the University of Pittsburgh, I looked at WashU in St. Louis, which is where I went. I think I may have, I looked at BU. In fact, Neil Blacklow, whom you know from UMass, Neil was at BU at that time. He came from BU out to UMass. In fact, that's how I got lured away from Barnes Jewish. I got a call from Neil saying that a new UMass was building a facility. They were connected to both St. Vincent and Memorial Hospital. The chief at Memorial, which was Peter Levine, wanted an ID person. He went to Neil, and Neil gave him my name because Neil had recruited me for BU 2 years earlier when I finished my fellowship. So I came and looked at. I grew up in Framingham. My wife grew up in Cambridge. Her parents were still alive as well. And quite honestly, St. Louis, like Gertrude Stein said about Oakland many years ago, there's no there there. St. Louis is not very exciting. It's gotten better, I think. But hot as hell, humid, dusty in the summer, no hockey rinks. They did have the Blues, but even that was a disgrace. They played in a giant, almost a rodeo hall. The ugliest building for hockey I've ever been in. We lived in Clayton, which is probably the nicest town we've ever lived in. And they had wonderful suburban resources in the town. They were the location for the headquarters of several of the big Missouri industries. Mallinckrodt, what is the checkerboard one? Ralston Purina. So the taxes were low, the amenities were fantastic, including an outdoor skating rink where my kids got started in hockey. But it was a long way from both sets of parents. Too hot in the summer, no natural ice in the winter. Exciting university med school system. Excellent, but I was eager to get back to the Northeast.
And so you came to Memorial.
Yep.
And it sounds like you started the ID service.
I was the ID service.
Right.
Yeah, there was none.
Right. So how did that go?
It was interesting. I mean, again, Hopkins prepared me for it. I was on call every day of the year, unless I physically left town, and one of the ID people at the university would cover for me. I was on all the time. So once we started adding some people, it got a lot better. Particularly when you think of some of the people we added. We added Jennifer Daly initially. She ultimately got lured by the ivory tower phenomenon of being at the university. Mark Kerouac came next. He had just finished fellowship at the Brigham under the late and great Louis Weinstein. Mark joined us. So there were then two of us. That was better. I was on only half the time. And Mark, I don't know if you knew Mark very well, but Mark is one of the smartest people I've ever met, in general, but particularly in medicine in general and ID in particular. So it was great being having him as a
Good
partner.
team.
Good team.
And so what kind of diseases were you treating early on? Now we're so just to keep the calendar right, you're roughly early 70s, are
No,
you?
this would be,
Mid-70s?
I finished
Mid-70s?
fellowship in 75.
Okay,
77 came to UMass
Okay.
after 2 years in St. Louis.
okay, good. And what kind of diseases were you treating? What kind of treatments were you using?
Well, fortunately, because Worcester has a sizable international population, I was still getting to see a fair number of exotic diseases that people either came in with as residents or as people traveled, particularly with people like companies like Norton, which had, probably a foothold in every country on earth. A lot of people were traveling for business. The immigrants would often go home and come back. And of course, immigrants never stop in and ask about prophylaxis for malaria because they grew up with it. When they start having children, then they begin to think of it. They bring the kids in, and while they're listening to your presentation about all the diseases they don't want to get in third world, I don't use the word third world, in developing countries, they say, well, can I see you too? Can I get some shots and pills as well? But I would say on the, that was, tropical diseases probably were I was most identified with. In fact, when I arrived, almost instantly, Neil Blacklow said, "You're going to teach parasitology." Now, I knew malaria very well, but general parasitology was not on the tip of my tongue. But they were using people that were rented from Harvard Med School. They had to pay for it. And the two guys they had spoke horrible English, almost unintelligible, very thickly accented English. So I was free and I speak pretty good English. So he thrust all of parasitology, oh, and by the way, mycology, which never was one of my favorite areas. So suddenly upon arrival, I had to develop about 8 hours of coursework in microbiology. The only one that was easy was malaria because I'd been doing it for 2 years and publishing on it. I did basic research on malaria. So that got me across the wide spectrum of parasitology.
And late 70s, what were your, most recent victories in ID, and what were the diseases that you really were frustrated by because you didn't have good treatments for them?
I would say the biggest successes were in bacterial diseases because antibiotics were hot. The arrival of gentamicin, then the arrival of amikacin, tobramycin, the advance from primitive cephalosporins to second and third generation cephalosporins, the development of carbenicillin followed by ticarcillin, and most importantly by piperacillin, which is still used today. And as an aside, I don't know if you ever prescribed carbenicillin, but the dosage was 40 grams a day. The salt, and it's a 2-sodium molecule, so the salt load was astronomical. So piperacillin is still very effective, particularly when you combine it with a beta-lactamase inhibitor, Piptazo. Tobramycin and gentamicin still have, and amikacin still have some use. And of course, in the beta-lactam field, we've gone into the very modern beta-lactam. So the elements of what I was using have been developed progressively and are directionally still being used.
And then there was the 80s.
Well, before AIDS, we didn't talk about the fact that what did you treat fungal diseases with in the late 70s, early 80s? It was amphotericin, which we nicknamed amphoterrible because the amount of systemic side effects, the chills, the fever, the nephrotoxicity was astronomical. And if you ever put anybody on amphotericin, remember you had to do about a 4-hour slow workup. You give them 1 milligram, then you'd give them 10 milligrams. Then, and it was comically slow to do. The modern amphotericin, I don't know what they did to it, but is much better tolerated. And of course, most of what's used is amphotericin B, which is very well tolerated at a much higher dose.
Mm-hmm.
But the fluconazole-like drugs, itraconazole, these all came out, making the treatment of fungal disease much better. Mycology until that point was a field filled with one antifungal of note,
Mm-hmm.
and that was amphotericin.
Mm-hmm.
Viral disease the same way. I mean, early in your training, it was still pretty barren.
Mm-hmm.
You had fairly ugly drugs that didn't work very well. In fact, I remember one of the first trials done on herpes simplex encephalitis was with a drug called, I'm trying to think what the name was. And people did worse on it than not on it. And it already, untreated herpes simplex encephalitis is about 90% fatal. And it got worse with this drug. Acyclovir revolutionized the treatment of herpes simplex.
Mm-hmm.
So even viral diseases began to get a little more appealing because you could treat them. But viral diagnostics remained fairly primitive, slow, send-out type until probably the late 80s, early 90s. So that's the other reason I didn't like viral diseases. It took forever to confirm your diagnosis. You had to order a whole battery of viral serologies. Some of them were based on antibodies rather than actually finding the virus.
Sure.
Viral cultures were not very effective, and antiviral therapy was not very available. So again, I was not a big fan of viruses.
And yet the 80s were HIV.
Exactly. And that did spur rather rapidly the therapeutic approach to viruses,
Mm-hmm.
which was fantastic. I mean, you now see ads on TV for treating HIV with infrequent combination regimens that are very convenient. And people, it was a little bit like when concentrated factor VIII became available for hemophiliacs.
Mm-hmm.
You could take people, allow them, Peter Levine in fact pioneered self-started home therapy. They could tell when they're having a bleed even if nothing's apparent on physical exam. They would start a little scalp vein, infuse themselves, and stop the bleed.
Mm-hmm.
And there's where the connection with HIV came up. The factor VIII was generated in huge quantities with most of them were paid donors, many of them off Skid Row or from third world countries. And everybody got saturated, almost everybody got saturated with HIV. And there was no treatment at that time.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly nowadays, the only limitation to treating HIV is the patient's willingness to get diagnosed and take the medications.
Mm-hmm.
And again, I'm sure you remember the early antiretroviral drugs were horribly cumbersome, dozens of tablets, horrible side effects. It's miraculous now, except we don't have a vaccine.
Yeah, and yet the quest for progress in dealing with HIV, I think, introduced some changes of mindset and framework as far as the rights of patients and as far as the role of research in the FDA and the like with regard to the sort of linear progression from an experimental drug to a mainstream drug. They disrupted that a little bit.
Yeah.
Were you involved with that?
No. One of the phenomena that I perceived about HIV is that the people who gravitated to HIV management immediately were recent graduates of fellowships. They were seeing the patients. They were doing the frontline care.
Mm-hmm.
Because in many institutions, ID admitted the HIV patients,
Mm-hmm.
not to treat them for HIV because we had nothing, but to treat all of their complications, some of which were infectious, toxoencephalitis, pneumocystis, pneumonia.
Mm-hmm.
So the people coming through training programs and having finished training were the people that avidly accepted responsibility for HIV patients, not only when they were admitted, but also in the clinic.
Mm-hmm.
Initially, HIV patients were followed mostly in ID clinics.
Sure.
Some of them who required it from anti-hemophilia treatment stayed with hematologists.
Mm-hmm.
So the fellows and the recent graduates are very comfortable. and I certainly could manage these patients as inpatients, but I didn't gravitate to pulling many of them into my practice. I had my share because we all did, but I was not headed to become an HIV specialist, an AIDS specialist.
And as we move from the 80s into the 90s, regardless of your specialty, there's a lot of turbulence in the practice of medicine. Changes in configuration of practices, changes in the role of a hospital in the community, and innovations being introduced there. What was your experience with regard to these sort of administrative changes?
Well, let's look at hospital medicine first. I think, like most people who had been admitting their own patients since they started in practice, I found it intrusive in the beginning. The thought that someone else was going to manage, particularly if the patient is from my practice, one of my patients has to be admitted, I wasn't happy having a hospitalist pick them up. But over time, the scales fell from my eyes, and I realized that these people, as a team, are in the hospital 24/7. It's like having grown-up house staff. And over time, they get awfully good at treating almost anything and knowing when they need to call somebody in. And again, as a consultant, I knew that because they would call me for consults on patients they needed help on. So I became very fond of hospital medicine. I think that because of their living in-house, much like the old Osler house staff, they were there all the time. And so many of our patients are frequent flyers that they often got to know the patients personally as well. And I found them as a group, there's variation in any practice, I found them to be very compassionate practitioners. I didn't see them developing, in general, institutional mentalities. They approach patients in a very caring fashion. And I found, again, in general, they knew when they needed help and did not posture saying, I'm a hospitalist, I can take care of everything. They knew when to get diagnostic help.
Being in a hospital practice, were you an employee of the hospital?
Yes.
How did that work? And did you interact much with managed care companies?
No.
Okay.
The administration did that. I simply filled out whatever the billing system we were using, I did. I ran a paper route until I went off to college. It was the biggest paper route in the town of Framingham, 7 days a week. And I was good at it. I made enough money to help pay for college, big Christmas tips, the whole business. But that's it. My administrative, financial skills, they peaked when I was 17 years old. So I was never interested, never confident enough to run a personal practice, whether it's private or personal responsibility for my corporate practice. I know my weaknesses, and finances traditionally is one of them.
So you were a good fit. So I guess the other issue with regard to a compartmentalization of the practice of medicine has to do with handoffs and communication. Do you find that there were challenges with regard to that? Or?
For me personally, yes, just again, because my residency, my first years of practice, I was pretty much it. I was not used to transitioning responsibility. As we added additional people, I got better at it. But I've always been happier taking care of my own patients. You know, you can admit one of your own patients about 5 times faster than you can admit a new patient because you already know all about them. You don't want to get tunnel vision and ignore new things that have happened. But you know them both medically and personally. So having not grown up in much of a cross-coverage system, I like taking care of my own patients.
Now, the other side of that coin is if you're in an atmosphere where you've got your practice, you may not have as much ability to just have conversations and chat with other colleagues about what you're doing.
Not in ID.
Okay.
As you probably noticed, ID people are the most loquacious practitioners on earth. And we love to talk about our cases. And in fact, everywhere I've been, we've had case conference, which are usually unknown cases to the people discussing. In fact, if someone said, oh, I covered that patient over the weekend, that person isn't the discussant. And the nickname I gave to this is Stump the Chump. You're up there discussing, it's a bit like grand rounds, except it's much more informal. We'll do 3 or even 4 cases in an hour. And we still do it at UMass. There's Friday morning, 9 o'clock. The fellows present cases. Faculty who don't know the patient discuss the case, both from a diagnostic and a therapeutic point of view. In my opinion, the best cases are diagnostic focused, not therapeutic focused. So, you're putting your ego on the line. And I think one of the best features of it is that it shows the junior people that you're not smart all the time. You stumble through a differential diagnosis and you may be completely off base and not even touch on the special topic. Fortunately, I feel very comfortable doing that because my role model for it was a guy named Philip A. Tumulty at Hopkins, who was a brilliant general diagnostician. And when he did a CPC, routinely he would get a standing ovation. Even before the diagnosis came out, he would run through all the possibilities in almost encyclopedic fashion. And then he'd say, now let's focus. Those are all the possibilities. Here's what I think the patient has. And it didn't matter whether he got that case or not. It was the exercise he went through. ID people like that. They like to get under the spotlight and discuss a case that they don't know. And it can be nerve-wracking. As they say, you're always afraid you're going to get to the end and not even having mentioned it. In fact, one of the guys that bothered this most was the chief of ID at St. Vincent. I'm blocking on his name. He was there for about 10 or 15 years. And when he would get presented a case, he wouldn't stop. He'd just keep going, hoping that somewhere in that litany of diagnoses, he would at least have put it on the table. Very bright guy, but he didn't like being under the spotlight diagnostically. But gee, it's what we do all day, every day. We're always trying to figure out what the patient had. Not many people come in telling you what their problem is, except an OB. I have a baby inside me. Will you help get it out? But on the medical surgical side of OBGYN, you're always trying to narrow the possibilities down.
So there are 2 challenges here with the interactions with colleagues. On the one hand, you're being socialized into a mindset and an approach, and it is an apprenticeship in which you do what your elders do. On the other hand is the issue of critical thinking and creativity and trying to sort of disrupt that a little bit. And I'm wondering, what your thoughts are with regard to that, because these scenarios you described to me strike me as being very sort of open, and the availability to think differently was likely there.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
But that isn't always the case. I mean, if anything, these sort of sessions can be used to induce conformity.
They can be, but it's not hard to keep them free-flowing and free-thinking. I don't think I've ever been in an ID conference in the 3 venues I'm talking about. WashU in St. Louis, the MGH, UMass, where we felt constrained to disagree. And we get pretty good at pointing out that whoever the discussant is, no matter how senior, she may have left something out, and we politely add that to the differential. When if you're the person that missed that diagnosis, you look for a sword to throw yourself on. But no, the ID people tend to be collegial. That doesn't mean that we don't have jerks, but people can challenge each other. And part of the educational system is that you are expected to challenge, to offer alternative points. And given the speed at which science is evolving, therapeutics, diagnostics, the older people, the senior people, expect to have younger people point out things they didn't know about. Although it's interesting, when I was a fellow, we had crosstown unknown case rounds. Initially, they were centered on Louis Weinstein, who initially was at Tufts, but Tufts had a mandatory retirement age of 65. So when they retired him, he went to the Brigham. So we were with him in his Tufts days and then in his Brigham days, or years. And he had a couple of people with him who not only, they didn't advance therapeutically. I remember watching one of the guys who wanted to treat a case of pediatric meningitis with, I think it was sulfa and streptomycin. Now that had been done probably in the 1950s before modern antibiotics came about. But in the early 1970s, it was a complete anachronism, and it was dangerous as stupid. But this would come out. People would, some of the older people would come up with ideas that just left you dumbstruck. But generally, if you've got an open exchange system, the younger people will tell you about newer diagnostics, newer therapeutics. And that's one of the reasons IT people love these conferences, because they're learning experiences for everybody. Even Mort Schwartz, the smartest man in the world, would learn things during these case discussions.
Now, you retired
2 years ago.
Okay, so pre-COVID.
No, in COVID.
In COVID?
It was during the early months of COVID, when diagnostics were not great and therapeutics were nil. And I don't know whether it was Finberg or Doug Gollenbach, but I was told that no one over 65 was going to see patients, not just infectious disease patients, any patients, because anybody could be carrying COVID. So I was turned into a telephone doc. And I did nothing but sit on the phone and give advice to emergency physicians, physicians on the floor, house staff. And it was boring. William Osler, who had many great aphorisms, one of them was that to study medicine without textbooks is like going to sea without charts. But to study medicine without patients is like never going to sea at all. And I felt that way, not being banned from seeing patients. Because they were afraid, people over 65 have a much higher fatality rate. So they were protecting us. But I found being a physician without patients was boring. And I was 76 years old, so it was time.
The COVID pandemic drew out a lot of factors that had been sort of subterranean. And I'm curious to know what your take is on a lot of it. It has to do with how medical research is publicized and released to the public. When is it ready for prime time? How do you develop what innovations were introduced with regard to developing a vaccine? The role of the interface of public health and individual practice or individual health. What are your thoughts? You must have been thinking a lot while this was exploding on the news.
Well, I would say there were some wonderfully positive aspects that came out of this, and I think there were some condemnable negatives. I think the speed with which the virus was identified, it was elaborated, people knew how it worked. The speed with which diagnostic tests of varying ease and accuracy came about is phenomenal. And the development of an effective vaccine is mind-boggling. It's a matter of months from isolating the virus, identifying its features, and coming up with diagnostic tests that were highly accurate, and then ultimately coming up with a vaccine. The lag time between identifying COVID and coming up with a vaccine must have been on the order of, 18 months or something. Nothing moves that fast in medicine. Even once you've got it all figured out and you've got a product, whether it's an immunization or a vaccine or whether it's a therapeutic, the time it takes you to prove that it's effective and safe and get it marketed is years.
Yeah.
I mean, this telescoped the whole thing.
Yeah.
And part of it was it came at the right time. The virology aspects were incredibly well developed. The vaccine technology was well developed. It fell at the right time. All the spheres were in harmony. So it's gratifying. The negative part is the clamoring for credit, the pushing of products that I don't think were very good. I think the J&J vaccine, particularly as a single dose, was never a good idea. It's an old-fashioned vaccine. We had modern RNA technology. Right off the bat, they wanted 2 doses. Now they want 4. And they were much more with modernity. J&J was an old-fashioned vaccine, and they wanted it marketed as once. It just was a bad idea. And other countries did the same thing, developed their own vaccines, which were often poorly designed, poorly tested, and didn't do very well. So there was good and there was bad.
What would you say about, what have you learned, or what should we learn about the practice of public health in the United States?
Well, we've got that in COVID. CDC used to be, I think, unimpeachable. CDC was run by professional epidemiologists, most of them very good scientists, or at least very good administrators with solid medical backgrounds. When I went to NIH, the other elite draft dodging option was what was called the EIS, the Epidemiology Intelligence Service at CDC. There also was Indian Health and a few others. But from an academic point of view, the hottest was NIH. You maximized your chances of developing research skills. CDC was mostly figuring out problems, but it was an elite service. I don't know when the head of CDC became a strictly political appointment, but it was sometime in the last 10 or 15 years. So CDC was not well prepared for COVID. And they made some very bad decisions. They developed what they thought was a reliable diagnostic test, and it wasn't reliable. And CDC has never been a manufacturing plant. So even if the thing became the gold standard, they weren't going to be able to manufacture it. And yet they didn't want to let out the technology to a vaccine manufacturing outfit. So they messed up royally. They slowed down progress tremendously. It got very political. Having the idiot in chief running the government didn't help at all. But CDC pooped the bed.
Yeah.
They made a mess of it.
Yeah.
And slowed things down. And I think some of the competition among the drug companies for exclusive access, high prices, the government was willing to pay it. It wasn't coming out of anybody's personal bank account. But, you know, it was much more good than bad. And most admirable and most optimistic for the future is the speed with which the virus was isolated, cultivated, vaccine was made available, and distributed.
Agreed. So just we're getting to the end of our hour, and this has been terrific. Any sort of thoughts in closing you have regarding your career?
Well, no, one aspect that is, I'm not sure I'd call it negative, but was discouraging, you alluded to earlier. How did I do as, in my later years of practice, as everything got computerized and almost checklisted? I didn't like that at all. I don't want computers writing my notes. I'm not the most prosaic, gifted writer, but my notes were fun to read. I put a lot of personal items in. I spent more time with patients getting their social history, you know, where they grew up, background ethnically, jobs they held, things they like to do, things they shouldn't do. I love social history.
Yeah.
And people now just check things off.
Yeah.
In fact, my favorite, you almost get the feeling the way of asking social history is, you don't use drugs, do you? You don't have illicit sex, do you? You know, you're not asking them open-ended questions. You're shoving negative answers at them. I think that's part of what bothers me is the computerization of records has turned people into checklist things. And they don't engage the patient. Plus they can't. They've got, what, 20 minutes for a visit? And part of that is doing the checklist. So you can't sit there and engage a patient, either diagnostically or socially, trying to figure out, can they really buy this medication you want to send them home with? Who's going to be at home with your patient who's getting a little senile to make sure the things you want them to do are done? Now, I think some of the institutionalization of diagnosis and care is annoying, and I wouldn't have put up with it much longer. I mean, I would not use the dictation where the computer fills in. You give them a couple of key words and they give you a paragraph. No.
Yeah, the macros. Yeah. Okay. Well, but still, you've accomplished an enormous amount during your career. You've seen the field of infectious disease evolve amazingly, and diseases that were fatal being cured, treatments that were brutal being, modernized to something that was very tolerable and easily taken. So, yeah, what a remarkable period of time to be practicing infectious disease.
And been around long enough to see the evolution from things you couldn't confirm diagnostically, diseases you couldn't treat effectively, to now having something to offer patients for almost everything.
Yeah, it's really good. Well, this has been an excellent interview.
Well, thank you.
I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with us. Thank you very much.